So, I have been lucky to receive some declassified documents, more so leaked documents, from a defector from the Ukrainian NKVD. Pretty interesting documents that he had released to me, and I thank him for his generosity. I'm not going to reveal his identity for the sake of his safety and mine, and the safety of anyone that he's working with. So with that being said, let's just jump right into it. Alright guys, so, this particular document, a little separate, it's only about half a page in length, but it's pretty much an outline of, I gotta pause real quick. It's pretty much an outline of the various subversion tactics that are used within the Western world. Now, these subversion tactics are kind of used on both sides. It's kind of a bilateral subversion technique in that you don't just play one side of the aisle. You kind of have to preach to the choir in both camps. So, in other words, you have sort of three messages. Message one is preaching to the choir of blue team, and then message two is preaching to the choir of red team. And then message three is sort of just whatever's going to the public. Kind of this, I guess what you'd say, mainstream accepted public information. Or you could say that they are beliefs and ideology that are accepted by the mainstream public. They're sort of the socially acceptable narratives to push and peddle. And it's also important to note that there is also an undercurrent to all of this. The undercurrent, if you will, is essentially some means of... So it's very difficult to word it. So the undercurrent is essentially some kind of cultural cohesion factor, some kind of binding agent for a social organization that is driven by, the wording puts it, evolutionary subconscious biology. I'm sure that's like not correct in the grammar of it as you translate to English. So yeah, it's other words, kind of like this collective subconscious that is built by evolution, years and years and generations of evolution, selection, and competition. Essentially leads to sort of these various undercurrents within different societies. And as you look deeper, the undercurrents are oftentimes very similar. The main differences are going to be socioeconomic factors, not so much religious per se. The religious factors kind of just get pushed underneath the surface, whereas the social factors kind of get brought to the forefront, if you will. The religious factors are more just kind of a facade, an outward facing, if you will, face of the social undercurrent. Whereas the more sort of the, if you will, the heart and the blood vessels holding the body together, sort of holding this body of the social undercurrent and collective consciousness together, is more kind of that very deep-rooted, you could say, id sexual nature. So in other words, it's kind of like, if you will, these societies are essentially at their worst, you could say that when push comes to shove, said societies just kind of devolve into this, how do you put it, kind of animalistic societies. And so there's sort of almost these, a lot of these sort of primal facets of human nature and the human collective conscious. And when I say collective conscious, I don't mean as in like a woo-woo, far out kind of metaphysical or conspiracy or spiritual meaning. I mean as in sort of this driving force of human evolution that kind of wants to stay masked behind the surface as societies develop attitudes of altruism and kindness, and you could say more neotenized social behavior. So once again, big shout out to whoever released these documents to me, and also big shout out to my friend Jim and my other friend, my colleague Kayla. They both did a great job in helping me to analyze and then to put together this sort of analysis. So aside from the background and everything of all the sociological terms and psychosocial terms and the psychoanalytical terms, let's talk about the actual, I guess you could say, master plan itself. So the master plan, if you will want to call it that, is it has to be dynamic and it has to be adaptable to change, because it's not based or fixed on sort of a primary set of actions. It's not like, well, okay, so on this day and this month and this year at, 21:45, we're gonna blow up this building, and then we're gonna, broadcast this radio show, and we're gonna, make these subliminal messages in various movies, yada, yada, yada. That's more further on down the line. This is more a showing of a template as to how the West will be subverged. Now, mind you, this has also happened to Eastern societies. However, in modern Western societies, there's more of the, if you will, there's more of this kind of overarching or sort of mainstream social attitude as to how society is treated and to how individuals within a society is treated. However, once all that, if you want to call it, these socially accepted narratives are stripped away, and that when you begin to examine individuals on a subconscious, individual and small group level, when you look just underneath the surface, what you get is kind of a more animalistic nature that really the Western societies and Eastern societies don't really deviate much from. Yes, you could say that, well, people argue, well, Western societies are so woke and, gynocentric or whatever, and Eastern societies are so manly and, like bravado and all this shit, and they're so traditional. In reality, that's kind of not the case. It may appear to be on the surface, but the reality of it is much different. You can definitely see this with the way different people are treated. In other words, within mainstream society and most modern societies, I think a lot of people can agree that on a very deep level, I want to say between sort of that social undercurrent and what is known as sort of this mainstream socially acceptable code of ethics. So it's like you have this sort of overt code of ethics. Like a code of ethics and code of law and code of morality are very overt. They're very obvious, and they're usually put in a way that is politically correct for whatever society you have. Whereas the undercurrents, if you will, are sort of just based on, you could say, more primal human nature, and sort of, if you will, shoved under the surface. They're kind of not really overt. They're sort of more covert. And that's kind of a good place to start, simply because, well, there's always more just beneath the surface. And I want to say, in the way it plays out in Western societies versus Eastern societies is a bit different. In Eastern societies, Eastern societies are more of a shame-based culture. You could say a shame-based or a failure-based culture. So you could say that individuals in Eastern societies are motivated by the fear of shame and the pursuit of success. Whereas in Western cultures, individuals are more motivated by the fear of guilt and the pursuit of virtue. I'm kind of give you guys a little quick recap on sort of the metaphysical ethics, sort of objective ethics. In other words, objective morality, you could say, is based on objective evil, which is objective evil would sort of be the desire or willpower without ability. Innocence is sort of, you could say that innocence is sort of, if you will, innocence would be innocence is sort of the lack of desire and the lack of ability, or lack of willpower and the lack of ability. Whereas you could say that virtue is ability, it is sort of, you could say virtue in its pure sense would be unlimited ability, but however, the willpower and desire is restrained by what you could say is good character. And then on the flip side of the coin, you have, well, not the flip side of the coin, the other side of the square, more the corner adjacent, you have what you would call, you would have what you would call, I would say, as metaphysical gluttony or lust, or you could just say, I guess you would say it's a metaphysical slut. In other words, you have the ability to do something and you have no control over your willpower or desire. It's just unlimited desire coupled with the unlimited ability to get something done. So in other words, you could say that this is sort of, other words, just giving into temptation. So you could say that in a Western society, you could say that evil and lust are bad, or evil and gluttony are sort of frowned upon. More so, whereas in an Eastern society, you could say that innocence and virtue are more frowned upon. I would argue that in a Western society, evil seems to be the worst of the sins, in that you have sort of this unlimited desire. You sort of have this very strong willpower, but you're not really able to fulfill said desire and willpower, and so you may resort to more underhanded tactics. Whereas in an Eastern society, you could say that innocence is the worst of sins, in that you have essentially both a lack of willpower and a lack of ability to get something done. In other words, that's kind of where it leaves off. And so in a Western society, the pursuit of virtue is sort of the heroic good, whereas in an Eastern society, you could say the pursuit, or as you could say, the Eastern society, the fear of failure or the fear of innocence is sort of what drives behavior. I thank you all for this one. I think I've been rambling on for a bit. See you next time. Thanks.